The first thing the German women noticed about the American cowboys was not the guns, or the horses, or even the size of Texas itself. It was the fact that these men still knew how to smile. West Texas, September 1944. The transport truck rattled across a dirt road that seemed to stretch forever beneath a white sky, burned pale by heat. Dust rolled behind the tires in long red clouds, drifting across dry fence posts and open cattle fields that looked larger than entire villages back home. In the back of the truck, 12 German women sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, their gray prison uniforms stiff with travel dust and sweat. No one spoke much anymore. The Atlantic crossing had taken words out of them weeks ago. Elsa Reinhardt sat near the rear gate, one hand gripping the bench beside her as the truck bounced over another rut in the road. She was 27 years old, a former field nurse from Stuttgart, and she had spent the last 3 years surrounded by men who looked exhausted before sunrise. Thin men, nervous men, men whose faces had become sharp from hunger and fear. Back home, even the strongest soldiers eventually looked hollow. Or did that? It reduced people slowly, quietly, until every man seemed smaller than he had once been. Then the truck rounded a bend, and Elsa saw the ranch for the first time. A white farmhouse stood beneath a cluster of cottonwood trees beside a long wooden barn painted dark red by years of sun. Horses moved slowly behind a split-rail fence. Windmills turned lazily against the horizon. And standing near the corral were 3 American cowboys. Elsa stared without realizing she had stopped breathing. They were enormous. Not grotesque. Not intimidating in the way German propaganda posters had promised. Just large in a way that felt unreal after years of Europe at war. Broad shoulders beneath faded denim shirts. Thick arms darkened by sun. Heavy boots planted calmly in the dirt. One man leaned against the fence with one hand resting on the brim of his hat, completely relaxed beneath the brutal Texas heat. Another lifted a feed sack onto his shoulder as casually as if it weighed nothing at all. Elsa heard someone whisper beside her in German, "Dear God." The truck slowed near the barn. Gravel crunched beneath the tires. The women instinctively straightened their posture, preparing for shouting, orders, humiliation, something harsh and military. That was how transfers usually worked. Instead, the tallest cowboy stepped forward slowly, removing his leather gloves finger by finger before the truck even stopped moving. The gesture confused Elsa more than anything else she had seen since arriving in America. The man was older than the others, maybe late 30s, with sunburned skin and lines near his eyes carved deep by years outdoors. Dust covered his boots. His hat cast a shadow across his face. Yet there was nothing rushed or aggressive about him. He waited quietly while the soldiers unlocked the rear gate. Then he stepped aside to give the women room to climb down safely. Elsa hesitated when her boots touched Texas dirt for the first time. Heat shimmered above the ranch road. Somewhere nearby, a horse snorted softly. The cowboy looked at the women for a long moment before speaking in a low voice roughened by dust and coffee. "Long ride from Louisiana," he said. "You ladies hungry?" The question landed harder than any command could have. Elsa blinked at him, unsure she had understood correctly. Hungry. Not dangerous. Not prisoners. Hungry. Behind her, one of the younger girls nearly lost her footing climbing down from the truck. Before anyone else reacted, the cowboy moved forward and steadied her carefully by the elbow. His hand looked massive against her sleeve, but his grip was impossibly gentle. Elsa watched the girl stare up at him in complete silence. Then she noticed something else. The cowboy had removed his hat while speaking to them. Back home, men barely removed their hats for funerals anymore, or had stripped away small courtesies first. But here, in the middle of a Texas cattle ranch nearly 6,000 miles from Germany, a stranger still remembered manners. And for reasons Elsa could not yet explain, that unsettled her far more than fear ever had. The bunkhouse stood 50 yards behind the main ranch house, separated by a clothesline that moved slowly in. The evening wind. Elsa stepped inside carrying the small canvas bag that held everything she still owned in the world. The room smelled faintly of soap, cedar wood, and something warm cooking nearby. For iron beds lined each wall, each one already made with folded blankets and clean white sheets. Elsa stopped beside the nearest bed and touched the fabric carefully with her fingertips. Real cotton. Soft. Freshly washed. Across the room, Anna Weiss sat down heavily on her mattress and stared at the blanket in disbelief. "These are cleaner than the hospital beds back home," she whispered in German. No one answered her. The silence inside the bunkhouse felt strange, almost embarrassed. Outside, the ranch moved with slow evening rhythms the women had never heard before. Horses shifting in their stalls, boots crossing wooden porch boards, a screen door closing somewhere in the distance. No alarms, no artillery, no engines overhead. Just ordinary life continuing beneath a giant Texas sky. Elsa moved toward the window. From there she could see the cowboys near the corral, their silhouettes dark against the setting sun. One of them carried 2 heavy water buckets across the yard without appearing to strain. Another leaned beside the fence speaking quietly while rolling a cigarette between rough fingers. Everything about them seemed slow and unhurried. Back home, men no longer moved like that. In Germany, every motion had become sharp from stress. Fast, nervous. People lived as though the world might collapse during the next breath. Here, even the silence felt different. A knock came at the bunkhouse door. The women stiffened instantly. Elsa felt her shoulders tighten from instinct alone. Then the door opened halfway, and a middle-aged woman stepped inside carrying a tray of enamel coffee cups. "Thought you girls might want something warm before supper," she said gently. Her name, they would later learn, was Margaret Callahan, Jack's older sister. She wore a faded blue dress with flour dust still clinging to one sleeve. Her silver hair had been pinned back loosely, and her hands looked worn from years of ranch work. She crossed the room, setting cups down carefully one by one. Fresh coffee steamed into the cool evening air. Anna stared at the tray as if it might disappear. "For us?" she asked quietly. Margaret looked confused for half a second. "Well, I sure was not planning to drink all 8 cups myself." A few of the younger women laughed before catching themselves. The sound startled everyone in the room, including Elsa. She could not remember the last time laughter had entered a place without guilt following behind it. Margaret handed Elsa a cup last. "Sugar is on the kitchen table if you want it," she said. Elsa nodded politely, wrapping both hands around the warm enamel mug. The heat soaked slowly into her fingers. Real coffee, not the bitter substitute brewed from burned grain back home during the last years of the war. Outside the window, Jack Callahan crossed the yard carrying a saddle over one shoulder. The fading sunlight caught the dust along his shirt sleeves. He paused near the fence when one of the ranch hands said something that made the others laugh. Elsa watched him smile briefly before lowering his head again. It was such a small thing. A tired man smiling after work. Yet it unsettled her deeply. In Germany, smiles had become rare long before the surrender. They vanished one winter at a time until every face looked guarded. But here, these men still carried themselves like the world was worth waking up for tomorrow. Elsa lifted the coffee cup slowly toward her lips. For the first time in years, she realized she was no longer studying every room for danger the moment she entered it. And that frightened her almost as much as the war itself. Morning arrived slowly over the ranch, the sky turning pale blue above endless stretches of dry grass and fence lines silvered by dew. Elsa woke before sunrise out of old habit, her eyes opening instantly at the first sound outside the bunkhouse window. For a moment, she did not remember where she was. Then she heard cattle lowing in the distance and the soft creak of windmill blades turning above the fields. Texas. The word still felt unreal inside her mind. Around her, the other women slept beneath clean blankets, their breathing steady for the first time in weeks. Elsa sat up quietly and slipped her boots onto the wooden floor. The room was cool before the heat of day arrived. Outside, the ranch already stirred awake. Lantern light glowed faintly from the barn. Somewhere nearby, a horse stamped against packed dirt. Elsa stepped onto the porch, wrapping her thin gray sweater tighter against the morning breeze. She stopped immediately when she saw Jack Callahan standing near the corral alone. He was brushing down a chestnut horse beneath the hanging lantern, one large hand moving slowly along the animal's neck while steam rose from his coffee cup in the cold dawn air. Neither horse nor man appeared rushed. The scene looked impossibly calm. Elsa watched silently from the porch steps. Back home, mornings had become hard and mechanical during the war. Men shouted orders before sunrise. Trucks growled through dark streets. Faces looked gray from exhaustion before the day even began. But here, The cowboy moved like someone who still believed mornings deserved patience. Jack noticed her after a few moments, but did not seem surprised. He tipped his head politely toward the coffee pot sitting beside the fence rail. "Fresh coffee if you want some," he said. Elsa hesitated before walking closer. Gravel crunched beneath her boots. Up close, the horse looked enormous, taller at the shoulder than any animal she had worked around in Germany. It turned its head slightly toward her, breathing warm air into the cool morning. Elsa froze instinctively. Jack noticed at once. "He is gentle," he said quietly. "Name is Ranger." Elsa nodded but kept her distance. "I have never been this close to one before," she admitted. Jack looked mildly surprised by that. "Never." She shook her head. "Not like this." He rested one hand against the horse's neck. The contrast caught Elsa off guard again. His hand looked rough enough to split wood, yet the horse leaned calmly into the touch as if recognizing something safe. "Animals pay attention to nerves," Jack said. "You stay calm, they stay calm." Elsa looked at him carefully after he said it. The sentence sounded simple, but something inside it lingered. She realized he was speaking the same way he handled the ranch itself. No yelling, no sudden movements, just quiet steadiness. Jack poured coffee into a second enamel cup and handed it toward her. His fingers nearly covered the entire handle. Elsa accepted it carefully. "Thank you," she said. The cowboy nodded once and returned his attention to the horse. For a while neither of them spoke. The silence felt strangely comfortable. Dawn spread slowly across the ranch, turning fence posts gold beneath the rising sun. Elsa wrapped both hands around the warm cup and studied the cowboy beside her. His shoulders looked broad enough to block sunlight. Years of ranch work had thickened his arms and weathered his skin. Yet there was no hardness in the way he moved. No sharpness. That confused her more each hour she spent here. In Germany, strength and cruelty had become tangled together after years of war, until people barely knew the difference anymore. But this man carried strength the way the horse carried weight. Quietly, naturally, without needing anyone to fear it. Behind them, the bunkhouse door creaked open as Anna stepped sleepily onto the porch. She stopped when she saw Elsa standing beside the horse. "You are brave this morning," Anna teased softly in German. Elsa surprised herself by smiling faintly over the rim of her coffee cup. "No," she replied quietly while watching Jack tighten the saddle strap with steady hands. "I think I am simply beginning to feel less afraid." The heat settled over the ranch by late morning like a heavy blanket laid across the earth. Cicadas screamed from the cottonwood trees near the water troughs, and the air above the fields shimmered beneath the Texas sun. Elsa stood beside Anna and two other women near the barn sorting feed sacks while ranch hands moved cattle through a nearby gate. Dust floated lazily through beams of sunlight spilling between the wooden boards overhead. Sweat dampened the collar of Elsa's gray work shirt, but she said nothing. Everyone worked quietly here. No shouting, no whistles, just the steady rhythm of labor moving beneath the endless sky. From inside the barn, Elsa could hear the cowboys talking while repairing a wagon wheel. Their voices carried low and relaxed. Through the heat, one laughed deeply at something another man said, the sound warm and unguarded. Elsa noticed the women around her listening without meaning to. In Germany, male voices had changed during the war. They became clipped, sharp, impatient. Every conversation carried urgency, as though people no longer had enough time left for softness. But here, these men still sounded human. Anna wiped dust from her forehead with the back of her hand and glanced toward the barn entrance. "They really are enormous," she whispered in German. Greta, the oldest among them at 34, snorted quietly while lifting another sack. "Not just enormous," she murmured back. "Healthy." Elsa looked toward the open barn door. Jack Callahan stood near the wagon while holding a wrench in one hand, while listening to one of the younger ranch hands complain about the heat. Even leaning casually against the workbench, he looked powerful in a way Elsa struggled to explain. Not military, not aggressive, simply solid. Like the ranch itself had shaped him out of wood, leather, and sunlight. Another cowboy stepped past carrying a crate of horseshoes against his chest. Anna watched him disappear toward the corral before speaking again in a lower voice. Back home, men looked 50 years old by 30. No one answered because all of them understood exactly what she meant. Elsa remembered train stations crowded with exhausted soldiers whose uniforms hung loose against thin bodies. Men who smoked endlessly because their hands shook if they stopped. Men who no longer laughed in public. War had consumed them slowly from the inside out, until fear became part of their posture. Here, even the older cowboys moved with a kind of calm weight that felt foreign to her. During the noon break, the ranch hands gathered beneath a shade awning beside the main house. Margaret Callahan brought out plates stacked with biscuits, beans, smoked beef, and sliced peaches chilled in a bucket of well water. Elsa sat carefully at the far end of the long wooden table beside the other German women. At first the conversation stayed polite and distant. Then one of the younger cowboys reached for the biscuit tray and accidentally knocked over his coffee cup, spilling it across the table. The dark liquid splashed onto his jeans and boots. Elsa instinctively braced herself for shouting or embarrassment. Instead, the entire table burst into laughter, including the cowboy himself. Jack handed the man a dish towel, without even looking up from his plate. "Tommy," he said calmly, "one of these days you are going to drown yourself in coffee." More laughter rolled across the table. Simple laughter. Easy laughter. Elsa lowered her eyes toward her plate because something inside her chest tightened unexpectedly. She realized she could not remember the last time she had seen grown men laugh, without tension hiding underneath it. Jack glanced toward her after a moment, perhaps noticing her silence. "You ladies settling in all right?" he asked. Elsa nodded carefully. "Yes," she answered softly. "It is very different here." Jack wiped his hands slowly with a cloth napkin before replying. "Different can be good sometimes." Elsa looked at him then. Really looked at him. The dust on his sleeves. The deep lines near his eyes from years under the sun. The quiet steadiness in his expression. Around them, lunch continued beneath the giant Texas sky, while horses shifted lazily beyond the fence line. For the first time since arriving in America, Elsa began wondering something she never thought possible. Maybe strength did not always have to arrive carrying fear beside it. The afternoons on the ranch stretched long beneath the September sun, the heat settling deep into the wood fences and barn roofs until even the wind felt warm against the skin. Elsa spent most days near the horse corrals now, helping clean tack, carry feed buckets, and brush down the calmer animals after work. At first she stayed close to the fence whenever the horses moved nearby. Their size unnerved her. The sound of hooves against packed dirt reminded her how fragile the human body truly was. But each morning Jack worked beside the animals with the same quiet patience, and slowly the fear inside her began loosening its grip. One evening near sunset, Elsa stood alone outside the corral brushing dust from a saddle blanket while the ranch hands finished bringing cattle in from the western pasture. The sky glowed orange across the open land, turning the distant hills dark purple beneath the fading light. Somewhere behind the barn, someone played a harmonica softly enough that the melody drifted through the warm air like smoke. Elsa paused when she noticed Ranger standing alone near the fence, his ears twitching lazily as flies circled his neck. The horse looked calm tonight, almost curious. Elsa studied him for several seconds before taking one careful step closer. Then another. Ranger turned his head toward her, but did not move away. Elsa reached out slowly, her hand trembling despite herself. Just before her fingers touched the horse's neck, Ranger suddenly snorted and shifted his weight. Elsa jerked backward immediately. The saddle blanket slipped from her arms into the dirt. "Easy," Jack's voice said gently behind her. Elsa turned sharply. She had not heard him approach. Jack stepped beside her carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder, his hat pushed back slightly from the heat. He glanced toward the nervous horse before looking at Elsa again. "He can feel when somebody is scared," he said calmly. Elsa bent quickly to pick up the fallen blanket, embarrassed by her reaction. "I know," she admitted quietly. Jack crouched beside her and lifted the other end of the blanket with one hand. Even kneeling beside her, he still seemed impossibly large. "You ever work around horses back home?" he asked. Elsa shook her head. "Only hospital wagons. The horses there were always frightened." Jack nodded once as if he understood more than she had actually said. He walked toward Ranger slowly, resting one hand against the horse's shoulder. "Animals remember tension," he said. "Same as people do." The horse relaxed almost instantly beneath his touch. Elsa watched carefully. Jack never yanked the reins or barked commands. He barely spoke at all. Yet the animal trusted him completely. After a moment, he held the lead rope out toward her. Elsa stared at it uncertainly. "Come here," Jack said softly. "He will stay calm if you stay calm." Elsa hesitated before stepping forward. The dirt crunched beneath her boots. Ranger lowered his head slightly as she approached, warm breath rolling from his nostrils into the cooling evening air. Jack remained beside the horse, one hand resting lightly against the saddle strap. "There you go," he murmured. "Slow." Elsa reached out again, this time touching the horse carefully along the neck. Horsehair brushed against her fingertips. Warm skin. Steady breathing. Ranger did not move away. Elsa blinked in surprise. Behind her, the sunset deepened across the Texas sky, while cicadas hummed through the grass beyond the fences. For several quiet seconds, nobody spoke. Then Anna's voice called from the bunkhouse porch. "Elsa," she shouted in German. "If you become a cowgirl before winter, I will never forgive you." Laughter erupted from the porch behind her. Even Jack smiled faintly beneath the brim of his hat. Elsa looked down at her hand resting against the horse's neck and realized something strange. Her pulse had finally slowed. Not because the world felt safe again, but because, standing beside this quiet cowboy beneath the giant evening sky, she no longer felt alone inside her fear. Night settled softly over the ranch after the heat finally released its grip on the land. The sky stretched black and endless above Texas, crowded with stars brighter than anything Elsa remembered seeing in Europe. Out beyond the fence lines, cattle shifted through the dark fields while crickets hummed steadily beneath the warm wind. The women gathered outside the bunkhouse after supper, sitting along the porch steps with enamel coffee cups warming their hands. A single lantern glowed beside the door, casting long amber shadows across the wooden boards. Someone inside the main house had left a radio playing quietly. American jazz drifted through the screen windows in slow, crackling waves. Elsa leaned against the porch rail listening while Anna brushed dust from her skirt beside her. "I still cannot believe how large they are," Anna whispered suddenly in German, glancing toward the distant barn where silhouettes moved beneath hanging lanterns. Greta laughed softly into her coffee cup. "You have mentioned that every day this week." "Because every day? It still shocks me," Anna replied. The younger one carried 2 water buckets and an entire toolbox at the same time this afternoon. "That is called ranch work," Greta teased. "No," Anna said quietly. "It is something else." Elsa stayed silent, but she understood exactly what Anna meant. Earlier that evening, she had watched Jack lift a broken wagon wheel upright without apparent effort while speaking calmly to one of the ranch hands about tomorrow's cattle shipment. Nothing about him looked strained. Even his strength seemed unhurried. Back home, men carried exhaustion before they carried anything else. The war had bent their shoulders downward year after year until nobody stood straight anymore. Here, the cowboys moved as though the land itself fed something stronger inside them. Greta stretched her legs slowly across the porch boards. "It is not only their size," she murmured after a moment. "It is the way they behave." Anna nodded immediately. "Exactly." Elsa glanced toward them. "What do you mean?" Greta looked out across the moonlit fields while searching for the right words. "Back home," she said quietly, "men always looked angry even when they were not speaking." Nobody answered because all of them remembered it too clearly. Train stations crowded with worried faces. Fathers staring silently at ration lines. Soldiers too young already carrying the eyes of old men. Years of fear had settled into Germany like winter fog that never lifted. But here, these American cowboys still laughed openly after long days of work. They removed their hats before entering rooms. They held doors without thinking about it. They spoke to women without impatience hiding underneath their voices. Anna lowered her coffee cup carefully. "Today Tommy apologized because he accidentally stepped in front of me while carrying feed," she said softly. "He apologized 3 times. Greta shook her head slowly in disbelief. In Europe, people barely apologized for surviving. The women fell quiet again. The radio music drifted gently through the warm darkness while moths circled the porch lantern. Elsa looked toward the barn where Jack stood beside the corral gate speaking with another ranch hand. Even from a distance, his outline looked broad enough to block moonlight. Yet there was nothing threatening about him standing there beneath the stars with one hand resting lazily against the fence post. Elsa remembered the way he spoke to Ranger earlier that evening. Calm, patient, almost gentle. A strange realization settled slowly inside her chest. These men were not frightening because they were powerful. They were unsettling because they were powerful without needing anyone else to feel small. Anna suddenly smiled to herself while staring out across the ranch. Maybe America is why they look different, she said quietly. Maybe a country this large makes people larger too. Greta laughed softly. Then Germany must have become very small during the war. Elsa looked down into her coffee cup while the warm night breeze moved through the porch screens behind them. Somewhere in the darkness, a horse snorted softly near the barn. She thought about all the men she had known before the war ended. Men reduced by fear. Men sharpened by hunger. Men taught that hardness was the same thing as strength. Then she thought about Jack Callahan quietly brushing down a horse beneath sunrise lantern light. And for the first time in years, Elsa realized she was beginning to imagine a different kind of future for the world than the one she had survived. 3 weeks passed on the ranch before the first government car arrived. The sound reached the fields long before anyone saw it, an engine moving too fast across the dirt road leading from town. Elsa looked up from the water trough she was scrubbing beside the barn as dust rose in the distance beneath the noon sun. Across the pasture, the ranch hands slowed their work almost instinctively. Even the horses seemed to notice the sudden change in rhythm. Jack stood near the loading gate repairing a section of fence wire when the Black Army sedan finally rolled into the yard. 2 men stepped out wearing pressed khaki uniforms untouched by ranch dust or heat. Their boots looked polished enough to reflect sunlight. Elsa immediately recognized the difference between them and the cowboys around her. These men carried tension inside. Their posture, everything about them looked sharp, controlled, temporary. One of the officers removed his sunglasses slowly while studying the German women working near the barn. His expression tightened almost immediately. "This is the Callahan Ranch?" he asked. Jack wiped his hands on a cloth rag before walking forward calmly. "That is right." The taller officer glanced toward the women again. "You are housing all 12 prisoners here?" "Yes, sir." The officer frowned slightly as though something about the scene irritated him. Maybe it was the sight of the women moving freely through the ranch yard. Maybe it was the sound of quiet conversation drifting from the barn. Or maybe it was simply the fact that nobody here looked afraid. Elsa lowered her eyes toward the trough while listening carefully. Years of war had trained people to recognize danger by tone alone. "We received reports from town," the officer continued. "Some locals believe these prisoners are becoming too comfortable." One of the younger ranch hands muttered something beneath his breath, but Jack silenced him with a glance before looking back at the officer. "They work hard," he said evenly. Hard work was not the concern mentioned in the reports. The officer removed a folded document from his jacket pocket. The War Department approved labor assignments, not social integration. Elsa felt the atmosphere around the yard tighten instantly. Nearby, Anna stopped carrying feed buckets altogether. Even the horses seemed quieter beneath the crushing afternoon heat. The second officer stepped toward the bunkhouse, studying the porch chairs and flower pots Margaret had placed beside the steps earlier that week. "You gave them rocking chairs?" he asked flatly. Margaret Callahan emerged from the main house, carrying a tray of iced tea glasses. She looked from the officers to Jack before answering calmly. "No, sir. I gave them somewhere to sit after 14 hours of work." Neither officer responded. Elsa noticed the taller one watching the women carefully now, almost suspiciously, as if kindness itself violated regulations. "These are enemy prisoners," he finally said. Jack stood completely still beside the fence post, one large hand resting lightly against the brim of his hat. "They are women working a ranch in 100-degree weather," he replied. The officer's jaw tightened. "You are getting personally involved with prisoners under federal supervision, Mr. Callahan." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Wind pushed slowly through the dry grass beyond the corrals while dust swirled around the officer's polished boots. Elsa felt the familiar tension of authority settling into the ranch yard like a storm cloud. She recognized this kind of silence, the kind where everyone waited to see whether power would choose cruelty simply because it could. Then Jack spoke again, his voice calm enough that it almost sounded tired. "Funny thing," he said quietly. "Back when this war started, people said Americans were supposed to be different." The officer stared at him. Jack nodded once toward the women beside the barn. "I figure if a person works hard, follows rules, and treats others decent, Then maybe they deserved decency back. The ranch fell silent after that. Complete silence. Elsa looked toward Jack beneath the blazing Texas sun and realized something she would remember for the rest of her life. The strongest man on the ranch was not the one carrying the most authority. It was the one standing perfectly still without needing to raise his voice. The army officers stayed only 2 hours, but the tension they left behind lingered across the ranch long after their car disappeared into the evening dust. Nobody spoke much during supper that night. Plates clinked softly against the long wooden table while the ceiling fan turned lazily above their heads. Outside the kitchen windows, the sky darkened from orange to deep blue over the open Texas fields. Elsa sat beside Anna, turning her coffee cup slowly between both hands. Across from them, the ranch hands ate quietly, their usual easy laughter replaced by thoughtful silence. Jack sat at the far end of the table near the screen door, one elbow resting against the chair, while Margaret filled glasses with iced tea beside him. Nothing about his expression looked angry, but Elsa noticed the tiredness around his eyes for the first time since arriving at the ranch. The younger cowboy Tommy finally broke the silence. "Town is talking," he muttered while cutting into a biscuit. "People get nervous seeing German women working free around here." Margaret snorted softly from the kitchen counter. "People get nervous every time somebody different shows up anywhere." Tommy shrugged awkwardly. "Still, folks lost sons overseas." The room quieted again after that. Elsa lowered her eyes toward the tablecloth. She understood more English now than the ranch hands realized. Enough to hear the discomfort hiding underneath their words. Enough to recognize the old shape of suspicion returning. We're always left suspicion behind like smoke after a fire. Jack folded his napkin carefully beside his plate before speaking. "Nobody said they had to forget the war," he said calmly. "But treating people decent should not feel controversial." Tommy rubbed the back of his neck. "I know that, Jack." "Do you?" Jack asked quietly. His tone stayed level, almost gentle, which somehow made the words heavier. The younger cowboy looked down at his plate without answering. Elsa watched the exchange carefully. Back home, disagreement between men usually arrived sharp and loud after years of fear. But here, even tension moved differently. Nobody pounded fists against tables. Nobody shouted to win. Jack simply spoke with the same steady calm he used around frightened horses. That realization settled deeply inside Elsa's chest. Strength without cruelty. She still struggled to fully understand it. Later that evening, Elsa stepped outside alone after supper. Warm wind rolled across the ranch, carrying the smell of dry grass and leather from the barn. The porch lantern cast soft amber light across the wooden steps while moths drifted lazily around the glass. In the distance, she could hear the ranch hands finishing evening chores near the corrals. Elsa wrapped her sweater tighter around herself and stared toward the dark horizon. Germany felt unimaginably far away tonight. She wondered whether people back home still looked over their shoulders every time boots crossed a street. Whether men there still carried war inside their posture. Like a permanent wound, the screen door creaked softly behind her. Jack stepped onto the porch carrying 2 enamel coffee cups. He offered one toward her without speaking. Steam curled into the cool night air between them. "Thank you," Elsa said quietly. Jack leaned against the porch rail beside her. For a while neither spoke. Crickets hummed through the fields beyond the fence line, while stars crowded the enormous Texas sky overhead. Finally, Elsa glanced toward him. "The officers think we are too comfortable here," she said carefully. Jack looked out toward the barn instead of answering immediately. "Maybe they forgot what normal people are supposed to look like," he said after a moment. Elsa studied him quietly. "Were you always like this?" she asked before she could stop herself. Jack glanced sideways beneath the brim of his hat. "Like what?" Elsa searched for the words. "Calm." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "No, ma'am," he said softly. "World just taught me angry men usually make things worse." Elsa looked down into her coffee cup while warm wind moved across the porch boards beneath their boots. Somewhere out near the corrals, rangers snorted softly in the dark. And standing beside the quiet cowboy beneath the endless American sky, Elsa finally understood what had unsettled her from the very beginning. These men were not larger because of their bodies. They were larger because fear had failed to shrink whatever was good inside them. The first cold wind of October arrived across the Texas plains just before sunrise, carrying the smell of dry cedar and distant rain through the ranch fences. Elsa stood alone beside the corral, watching pale morning light spread slowly across the fields. The grass moved in silver waves beneath the breeze while horses shifted lazily near the barn. Somewhere inside the bunkhouse, Anna still slept beneath heavy blankets, but Elsa had awakened early again, unable to ignore the strange peace that mornings on the ranch now carried inside them. It frightened her sometimes how quickly ordinary life had begun feeling natural again. A month earlier, she had stepped off a military truck believing America would be another prison. Now she knew the sound each horse made while feeding. She knew which floorboard on the porch creaked beneath Jack's boots. She knew Margaret always left fresh coffee warming before dawn. Small things. Human things. The kind war usually destroyed first. Elsa rested her arms against the fence rail while Ranger wandered closer through the cool mist. The horse nudged her shoulder gently, searching for sugar cubes she no longer forgot to carry in her pocket. Elsa smiled faintly while feeding him one from her palm. The movement felt automatic now, comfortable. Behind her, the barn door opened with a low groan. Jack stepped outside carrying his leather gloves and a steaming coffee cup. He paused when he noticed Elsa standing beside the horse. "Looks like he finally decided you are trustworthy," he said. Elsa glanced toward Ranger chewing contentedly beside her. "Maybe he realized I stopped being afraid." Jack nodded once beneath the brim of his hat. Animals notice that quicker than people do. He walked beside the fence rail and leaned against it quietly. Morning sunlight slowly touched the edge of the ranch roofs behind them. Elsa studied the cowboy from the corner of her eye. Dust still clung permanently to his boots. Fine lines marked the corners of his eyes from years beneath open skies. Yet standing there in the cold dawn air, he still carried the same calm steadiness that had unsettled her the first day she arrived. Only now she finally understood why. Back home, strength had always demanded hardness. Men proved themselves through silence, anger, endurance. But this man carried strength without making the world smaller around him. That difference changed something inside her more than she could explain. "I received a letter yesterday," Elsa said quietly after a while. Jack glanced toward her. "From Germany?" She nodded. "A cousin near Munich. She says the cities still feel gray even after the fighting ended." Wind moved softly through the fence posts around them. Elsa looked out across the endless Texas fields glowing gold beneath sunrise. "She asked me what Americans are really like," she admitted. Jack smiled faintly into his coffee cup. "That sounds dangerous." Elsa laughed softly under her breath. The sound surprised even her. "I did not know how to answer." Jack rested his forearms against the fence rail beside her. "Probably because there is no single answer." Elsa looked toward him carefully. "No," she said. "I think it is because I realized something here." He waited quietly. Elsa watched Ranger wander slowly toward the pasture before speaking again. "Back home, the war made people smaller inside themselves," she said softly. "Smaller dreams, smaller kindness, smaller patience." Morning sunlight spread fully across the ranch now, warming the frost-silvered grass beyond the corrals. Elsa looked at the cowboy standing beside her beneath the giant Texas sky. "Then I came here," she continued, "and met men who still remembered how to stay gentle." Jack lowered his eyes briefly toward the dirt beneath his boots, as if uncomfortable hearing praise spoken aloud. After a moment, he cleared his throat softly. "My mother used to say hard times show people who they already were." Elsa smiled faintly at that. Somewhere behind them, the bunkhouse door opened as the other women slowly began waking for another day on the ranch. Coffee scents drifted into the cold morning air. Horses shifted lazily near the fence line. And years later, long after the war finally became history instead of memory, Elsa Reinhardt would still remember that sunrise in Texas. Not because of the size of the cowboy she met there, but because, in a world exhausted by fear, they had somehow remained large enough to keep their humanity.